Hello, in this video, I want to continue the series that we've been talking about in terms of racial capitalism and its relationship to the workers' strike. In the last video, I talked a little bit just about what I thought some of the priorities were for policy teams that were trying to respond to racial cap, which I think will be like the central pivot that a lot of teams make if they normally read the cap on a lot of other resolutions, and it's kind of like the most comfortable place to go in order kind of like radicalizing the way they read the cap in order to respond to a lot of the policy affirmatives. And so in this kind of video and in the last one, I've just been talking about the ways in which I think policy teams can adapt their responses to have something a little bit more nuanced than just a question of just the cap good, cap bad, cap sustainable debate, and something that really makes it a lot more historically poignant, and something that I think allows you to really diversify the arguments that you would normatively read. And so hopefully this video is like a continuance of that, and you'll be able to get a lot more knowledge in it. If you're kind of like just hearing about racial capping and an idea of something to be read on this resolution, I would definitely go back and listen to the intro to racial cap and worker strike video, or watch the first and second parts, which kind of talk about the ways in which I think this criticism is most likely to be read against policy teams, because that kind of frames a lot of the stuff that I'll kind of be responding to and use to talk about in a lot of the rest of these videos. In the last video that I directly did, I just started talking about like what our priorities are and what I think some of the central questions for how you should be framing the debate in terms of allowing your app to be like weight against the status quo, and why that type of particular judge instruction is important, and then why I think those thesis arguments are then like really important in terms of how you're building central offense that allows you to bring the best historical arguments to really beat what I think the alternative and link differentials will kind of end up being closer to the end of the debate. And so in this video, I kind of want to continue talking about this in the context of going through more specific portions of the debate, like the linked debate, the permutation debate, impact comparison, alternative debating, which I think are all really important parts of kind of like talking through this particular type of debate, and are all really important parts to look at in order to figure out what kind of strategy that you think is the most ideal. So when we first kind of get to the link debate, I think that the link debate is definitely a place where I feel like a lot of the questions that are kind of brought up will probably most likely be repetitive. I think unless they're really reading links that are based off of like advantages that you've read in terms of like an extinction level, like war advantage, or like some type of democracy advantage, I definitely think that most of the link arguments will just be a question of why like not investing our resistance into the state as the locus should be good, and why kind of like why that's bad, sorry, and then why the kind of like human rights frameworks that are used in order to do that are bad. And I definitely think that there are a lot of interesting arguments to be made from the negative here, but I think as an affirmative team, being able to apply that kind of central framing argument that we talked about in the last video is the first central step to really being able to like level with the judge on how they should be thinking about these link arguments, being able to win like first and foremost that these link arguments are a question of like what is good in the world in which the plan has already been done, and not comparative to the status quo, because these kind of things aren't a question of weighing of like the world of like the post plan versus like the status quo. They're a question of just weighing like if that world that the plan is in is good or not in a vacuum, which isn't fair or contextual to what the affirmative's burden is. And I think that allows you to both make arguments about why that's like not accurate for how we should like contextually plan on the everyday, and isn't realistic to how like activists are on the ground and like workers unions have to like think about what protesting and tactics look like. But I also think that you have like a lot of really good arguments to make in terms of why then then becomes a question of like why questions of like not understanding our investment in policy is one that is a question of like total investment, but like it as a necessary set of tools to create the necessary like platform for radical resistance that is like kind of like done without like the kind of like threat of things like crackdown and like the harsh kind of like realities of forcing to make choices between like how one feeds one family and one's ability to like assert oneself as like a resistance as an agent of resistance. And I think that being able to then start pulling your link turn arguments on like why comparative the affirmative's like ability to be able to resolve a lot of these like more consequential things that happen in the status quo, you have a really strong argument to kind of like set up a lot of the arguments that you want to make later on. I then think that means that when you kind of like turn to the permutation form of the debate, this is where like being able to do a lot of historical examples can be extremely helpful, because I think that the more examples you're able to give of both how the alternative kind of like falls to questions of not just like crackdown, but like historical relationships where the state consumes the projects of various radical resistance groups and turns them into various like institutional practices that become like financialized, and why that process can only be stopped by like basically creating like a political platform for workers to be able to assert themselves via like an endorsement of the resolution. That you have a lot more arguments to make about why permutation isn't a question of like do we believe all out in the state or not, but is really a question of like what is the most like important and efficient moment or choice for like the time that we're in now, in order to create a sustainable like source of resistance resistance from trying to move on. And I also think that allows you to make a lot of net benefits, kind of like when I was saying in the last video about starting to bring this question of like immediacy to like the forefront of like how you're doing impact calculus and how you're making solvency questions, when you're able to go into these arguments and be like things like climate change, things like wage inequality and poverty are like already here and coming now. It's a question of like how we can create the most efficient way for like workers to be like a central kind of like organizing frame for how we get to that, to resisting those types of inequalities. And so the 1AC is kind of like not just a necessary first step, but it's like incredibly crucial in being able to create a way for workers to assert themselves in such a way that like makes their like existence endemic to being able to like organize or have a private enterprise in the first place. So many private enterprises thrive off of dissuading or threatening workers and to not join workers unions because of like the punitive nature of like their private affairs. And I feel like using the policy of the 1AC to kind of for a differential way to look like that is definitely a step that it should be able to be weighed against a lot of the consequences of the things that the alternative is kind of raising as like a necessary counter to that. Because then when I think when you move to like the impact comparison alternative sources of debating, a lot of your alternative sources of debating is not just a question of crackdown, but a question of what that spill up looks like outside of the vacuum that the 1AC is supposed to fill in. Like in a world where we're so against politics that there can be no recognition of the movements by politics as a whole, what does it look like for there to be a substantial change in the ways in which like these policies that create the unequal like kind of terms of how workers are supposed to orient as conditions themselves? How are we supposed to get closer to questions of like abolition, prisoner strikes, etc., when there can be no way for us to assert like under the law a frame for what resistance looks like for those that are like basically coerced into like being productive under capitalism? And I think that there are then kind of like a lot more texture and weight to then just being like, oh, the state will crack down, and it's really just a question of like how state consumption actively makes the status quo worse instead of the affirmative, which may in a vacuum not be perfect, but definitely is preferable compared to like how the status quo treats and think about the relationship to movements and the way in which the state kind of takes a passive, more neutral frame in its relationship to responding to scenes of resistance, which I think the affirmative can serve as a much needed corrective to. Hopefully this kind of like framing is useful for how you'll be able to respond to these types of criticisms, and hopefully you'll be able to use it as you move forward. And yeah, thanks.